That's what makes it look like that owl, I think.
Is
that something the library has?
We bought it for the.
Oh, Bethany can see me. Okay, good.
There you go.
Should we get started?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, hey, everybody, my name is Courtney Cowgill, and I'm going to be talking today about trust and news and food. And it seems like those are not super connected, but go with me. I've got a theory. And how I came to this is I have a funny, funny background and career that started, as I told you all, the Great Falls Tribune teen panel when I was 15 or 16. I graduated, I grew up in Dutton. And when I graduated, I did everything that every small town girl does, which is I vowed I would never marry a farmer and I would never move home. Flash forward 25 years, I married a farmer, I moved home. But in between there, I worked as a journalist. I graduated from the University of Montana School of Journalism, and I went on to cover the Capitol for lead newspapers under Chuck Johnson for a while. So I covered the legislative session, or the Montana legislature, and then I went on to work for the Associated Press, both in Montana and then in Omaha, Nebraska. And in Nebraska was about when I started to make my boomerang back home. I'm one of those boomerang kids, which I know there's a lot of them around, who grow up in a small town and leave, and then decide that it's time to come back. And what was happening at the time is I had made this plan. I was going to the AP was a pretty good ticket to get up to where I wanted to be, which was I wanted to be a correspondent in Washington, D.C. I did an internship in a magazine in Washington, D.C., and I thought this is where I'm going to be. But I was halfway there physically and otherwise when I got to Omaha, and I spent some time there. And while I was there as a reporter, I was writing a lot about rural issues, and in particular rural decline. And at the same time at home in Dutton, our school was consolidating, our grocery store closed, and our newspaper closed. And that's when things really started to change for that community. So I was really tuned into what was going on in rural places, and I was writing about it mostly for a national audience at the Associated Press. And it was there and then that I decided, number one, I didn't want to be away from Montana for one more second, as most of us somehow realize that even if it takes a bit, or it took me a shorter amount of time than I expected to come to that realization. And so I moved back home to start a magazine in Missoula, and I was there for 5 years. And that's where I re-met my husband. I met him at a track. He was from Centerville, I was from Dutton, so we ran in the same circle. I met him in a track meet when I was in 6th grade. I think he was in 8th grade. And we lost touch with each other. He also did his requisite stint in the Midwest and decided that he was going to move home. We moved back to Montana the same week, and both of us were lamenting. He was doing his master's thesis on rural communities and ag communities. And I was doing all of this writing about the decline in rural communities and how kids weren't moving back, and what was happening to these small towns that we loved so much. And so we were both doing this kind of tandem, and then we were both like, boy, look at us, we're part of the problem. We left, we didn't come back. We came back to Montana, but we came to Missoula, and there were these opportunities happening at home. So at the time I was teaching at the University of Montana, in addition to doing my journalism work. I started teaching journalism there in person. And then at one point, my soon-to-be husband said, I think I want to be a farmer. Oh no, I can see where this is heading. So we moved home, and Jacob spent 2 years working with Bob Quinn while I was in Missoula. And then when we got married, we moved to Conrad and started a small organic vegetable farm where we were selling vegetables as part of a community-supported agriculture program. So we were distributing the vegetables that we were growing to about 150 families in the area. So as far away as near Helena, but we were delivering mostly in Conrad and Dutton and Power and Shoto in the Great Falls area. So we did that for 12 years. And in that time, I continued to do work in journalism. And one of the things that I teach, so I kept freelancing and writing, and I kept teaching. And one of the things that I teach is the Legislative News Service, where we send students to the Capitol to cover the goings on at the Capitol for all of the rural weeklies in the state. So if you see a story from the legislature in the River Press or in the Shoto Acantha or in the Boulder Monitor or some of these smaller weeklies who don't have the resources to send somebody to Helena to cover the Capitol. So we cover rural issues. And so that's what I've been doing primarily at the university for 8. I think this would have been my 8th session. So for some time I've been doing that. And in that time, I started to see some correlations between news and food. And it had to do with the local aspect of it. So we heard from our customers time and time again that they were willing to pay more for our food and that they were willing to, because they could trust us. And I saw the same thing happening in the news ecosystem, where trust was waning in every other news source, but for local news, it remained. And so there are some commonalities between food and news. Number one, we both consume them, right, on a regular basis. Information we're consuming, but there's other aspects that are very similar. Both have seen tremendous change in the last 50 years. Bob can tell you that the change in agriculture has been dramatic. The change in the news ecosystem has also been dramatic, but local has always stayed strong for the most part. And that has a lot to do with trust. And so this is from a few years ago, but it's still very salient. As a society, we're having a crisis of trust in just about every institution. Everything from the military has stayed fairly strong, as you can see, but look at the great deal of confidence in law enforcement, universities, the executive branch, the judicial branch, the press, and the legislative branch. So writ large, across our society, across our culture, we are less trusting of the institutions that this country was really founded on. And in food, that's true as well. The changes in how food has been produced and distributed over the last 50 years, and particularly in the last 20 years, 30 years, has been really dramatic. We went from being communities that were mostly fed by each other and our neighbors to being communities who are being fed by a global system. But there's been a resurgence in trust and activity around both local food and local news. 50% of consumers, this is again a few years old, but I think still stands. 50% of consumers told the USDA's agricultural marketing division in 2014 that they're willing to pay up to 10% more for locally produced foods. And this is the most recent numbers from 2022 on trust in the media and the trust in media. And you can see that trust in national news organizations is really low. So there's only 21% of high trust, but that's doubled for local news. Also, the availability of both food and news has a lot to do with community health and individual health. I'm using this as an example because I'm going to talk about social media in a bit, and I'm pretty hard on social media sometimes. Even though I teach it right now, I'm teaching it to undergrads, but I teach it in a way that tries to make sure that we are trying to harness these tools to do good and to spread information and news and media that matters. And so I wanted to show, this is one of my favorite examples of using social media, local news, using social media in a community-based way. Over COVID, the Shoto Acantha started to live stream things like the county commission meeting and the library meeting. And as you can see, it's a very small room. There's no one else. There's no members of the public there, but the public is still able to kind of be there. This is probably of no surprise to anyone, but the number of food deserts is increasing dramatically across the United States. And food deserts mean that you have low access or no access to fresh food, to a grocery store of any kind or food of any kind. It happens, as you can tell, mostly in rural areas. So if you look at those green, those green spots are where the majority of the population is living either 10 or 20 miles more from a food access point. And according to the USDA, about 6% of the US population now lives in what's called a news desert or a food desert. There's also something called news deserts, and they correlate. So if you look at what has happened, so my analogy about Dutton losing its grocery store and its newspaper in short order, it tracks. In mostly rural places, you see that there are no newspaper or only one newspaper. More than a fifth of the nation's citizens live in news deserts with very limited access to local news or in communities at risk of being news deserts. That's 70 million people without a newspaper, which is pretty incredible. And some of the stats, some of the new research says that we're losing 2 newspapers a week in the US right now. It's just a really hard time to be a newspaper. So what does that mean? What does it mean to live in a news desert? You all are very lucky. You don't live in a news desert and you don't live in a food desert. But for communities that don't have a paper of record, a community news source that's locally based, there's a lot at stake. And over the summer, PBS NewsHour did a really fascinating piece about this tiny little town in Texas that the newspaper went out of business after many, many years. And the newspaper was pretty controversial. It ruffled a lot of feathers, but they had been in the same family for a long time. And the trust that they built up with their community, even the community members who didn't agree with maybe their views or their opinions, but did agree with the kinds of community-based reporting that they were doing. This is from a political science professor at Texas A&M. I worry that we are more susceptible to this kind of tribal attitude and behavior that sometimes political elites at a national level on both sides, they try to use that to sort of, for their own strategic advantage for elections or for what have you. She was talking about what happens when we lose community news sources. This is from the former publisher, and I loved this. It's hard to watch and listen to this report because she gets very emotional. She says, I tell people that we have sometimes helped good things happen and we have often stopped bad things from happening. And it's not because we're powerful, it's because information is powerful. And so I really think of, when I'm thinking, one of the other things that I have studied over the course of the last 20 years has been this, prompted by where I grew up and what's happened in Dutton. Although it is still there and is still kicking. I don't mean to say that Dutton's about to blow off the map, but it's close. And they're really working hard to build it back up. And part of what makes a town, as we know from everybody who studies these kinds of things, are the number of community assets that a community has. When you think of a community asset, this is the definition from the Center for Community Health and Development at the University of Kansas. A community asset is anything that can be used to improve the quality of community life. And so have you ever heard of the term asset mapping in communities, where you're looking at what the community assets are and mapping them to try to see, like, what's our viability as a community? And what are some, just think about what are some things that would fit this definition in your community assets.
Local hospital.
Yes. Grocery store, yes.
Library.
The pool, library.
Yeah.
Schools, yep.
Gas station.
Churches.
Gas station, the churches, and the newspaper. And there's been a push to start thinking about community assets, including the information source, including the newspaper. Because we see that, so you lose your school. So I grew up between Dutton and Brady. After I graduated from high school, Brady and Dutton consolidated, and Brady kids started coming to the Dutton school. Brady is almost non-existent at this point. There's still a post office there. There's some lovely people there who are still trying, but without a school, without a grocery store, without the other things that make up a town, it's hurting. And so in order to stay viable, you need multiple of these community assets. And one of them is a newspaper or a local news source that is devoted and answers to just the community. So what are some roles that a community news organization? You all know these fairly well because you have a news organization in town that does these things. Number one, they record the first draft of history. So I was talking to Emily earlier about how often she searches through the River Press to find certain dates or things, right? Or when did this happen? Or when did that happen? When did this person pass away? When was this person born? When did this person graduate? When did this person make the winning touchdown? When, it's a paper of record for so many things. And it really is the first draft of history. Also, it plays the role that our founders, so the founders of the United States of America, were so explicit about, that they put it as the very first amendment, which is freedom of the press. They believed that the press, a free press, was an integral way to keep our democracy in check, to keep it safe, to keep it free, by providing and creating that accountability and transparency for knowing what our elected officials are up to. We've elected them. How do we know what they're doing in our name? Through a free press. And I love teaching this to like middle school or elementary school kids, because they haven't grown up knowing this necessarily, because we take it for granted sometimes that we do have a powerful and free press in the United States. And even as we have stopped trusting the news media for lots of different reasons, which we can talk about later, all news media still provides that really important check, that really important transparency and accountability for everything from the county commission to the city council to Congress. And it is an important part of our, I like to tell, I've been teaching this to middle school kids, and I ask them, what would happen if just the government owned the media and you only got what the government said you could read? They were like, oh, that can happen? Yes, it's happening right now in other places in the country. It's a really important part of our democracy. The other thing that community news organizations provide is information which leads to community engagement. Like Cynthia was saying yesterday, if you don't know what's basic for lunch at the school, or if you don't know what's going on, if you don't know who needs help when, if you don't know when the board meeting is for, for this, that, or the other thing, you're not going to show up. You're not going to be the person who shows up to any of these meetings because you don't know what they're doing. Plus, you don't know if you have to pack the kids' lunch or not because they don't like, I don't know, tuna noodle casserole. For the record, that was my favorite because our school lunch had the crunched up potato chips on the top. My kid's not a fan. A community news organization also provides a mirror, which is also really important. It provides a sense of community identity and a sense of community pride. And that's something that Fort Benton has in spades. You're lucky. Not every community has that sense. And I think it has something to do with the fact that you have a really strong newspaper who is willing to do that accountability piece. And also the pumpkin carving contests and the high school sports and the things that show the world that, hey, we're small, but we exist and we matter. And that makes a giant difference. That's the reason that when your kid gets his name in the paper or you get your name in the paper, that's that's the feeling you get. I matter, I existed, I was here, an obituary, right? It's a critical piece of being able to reflect and be a mirror for a community. And also, studies have shown that having a strong newspaper in a community really encourages economic growth and sustainability in a community. On the advertising side, for instance, being able to reach local customers, but also in the coverage of being able to identify where the community's strengths and weaknesses are, what businesses are doing, how things are going. Studies show, like he said, that having a good community news source does help with the community's economic viability. I really like this from this is from a book called Saving Community Journalism. And the quote's from a guy from Harvard. Local news organizations are the glue that binds communities, reminding us every day of our collective identity, the stake we have in one another, and the lessons of history. It really summed it up nicely for me. Also, both, back to the food analogy, both good food and good news take a tremendous amount of resources to produce. Everything from the printing costs and the mailing costs to the workforce, the labor that's involved, to showing up at every single event and taking photographs and being that witness of history happening in your community. That is expensive in both time and money. And I know from personal experience that the amount of labor and time and energy that goes into creating good food is also very high. As anyone in here who's unfortunately married a farmer or is a farmer or has lived on a farm, that that being able to produce that food takes a lot of money, and getting it cheap or free has hidden costs. So on the egg side, when we pay less for a loaf of bread, the farmer also gets less. And there are also lots of other hidden costs. And on the side of news, we are paying for free news with our attention, right? Our attention has become a commodity that is being sold and resold. So this is something that I talk to my kids, any middle school or high school students I talk to, and my university students, is that you have to be, that what you're seeing when you get something for free, it's not free. You are paying with your attention and with your time. Because the social media companies or anybody, they're selling that attention to advertisers, right? And so they have a vested interest to continue getting more of your attention. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. That's sort of a high horse of mine. And feel free to knock me off of it if need be. But I'm sure you've all maybe had this happen where you said something out loud 3 days ago and now I'm seeing ads for it on Facebook, right? That we're paying in our privacy and in our attention for these free services that we are giving more and more of our time and attention to. The other thing that food and news have in common is that we now have more choices for both than we ever have before. So this is from 2018, social media as a primary news. So this is for the first time in 2018, social media surpassed print newspapers as a single news source, with 1 in 5 US adults reporting that they get news often via social media, more than they get it from a newspaper. This is from recently, from 2020, from the most recent snapshot of this. If you can see age-wise what's happening, right? As people, so ages 18 to 29, 48% are getting all of their news on social media. 65 plus are getting it mostly in print, 7%. Local TV, news or website app. So things are changing dramatically. The audience is changing dramatically. And what does that mean? This is from the Pew Research Center. When they did this study, they found that those who depend on social media are also more likely than other news consumers to be exposed to made up news such as conspiracy theories, and other falsehoods. Also, those who get their news primarily from social media are less informed about elections, politics, the world, and domestic events. They're less informed. They are getting more news, but they are ending up less informed. So this is my credo, is that everyone today is a publisher and an editor, because of the information that we have at our fingertips, either here or more often than not right here. So the stream of news that's coming at us on a regular basis. So what if we all took on that responsibility that old school journalists always did, which is to sort through all of that chaff and find the kernels of truth, which we all now have to do more often than we did 20 years ago when you got the newspaper or you watched the TV news at night and you knew that all of that information had been, well, not all, but most had been fact checked and run through a gatekeeper who had chosen these things based on a set of accepted mores and guidelines. And those would be seek truth. This is the first thing that we teach in journalism school, is the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. And honestly, I have taken it as something that everyone should learn. I've always told people that, you know, becoming a journalist and learning how to do journalism is great for being a journalist. I mean, those skills are obviously useful in being a reporter or an editor, but they also make you a better person and a better community member and a better citizen. Things like these things, being able to seek truth, looking to minimize harm, act independently and be accountable and transparent. And so shouldn't we all follow those? Aren't they, is it kind of a recipe for being a good citizen of the world? And this is where we're going to have some fun. So the other thing that I saw is that I was talking to I remember talking to young kids about their information diet. You know, what are the things that you're consuming? And it hit me that we should be talking about the things that we consume with our minds as much as we talk about the things that we're consuming with our mouth. So what if we were looking for a balanced diet? So when I teach this to middle schoolers and I have them list all the things that the kind of media consumption that they're doing on a daily basis, there's always one that says video games. And like, yes, absolutely. I'm not going to tell you you shouldn't play video games, but they should be up here. Fats, oils, and sweets, used sparingly, because what kind of nutrition, what kind of nutrition are you getting out of that video game? Is it feeding your brain in any way? So this might be another, I know they changed it from the pyramid to the plate when it comes to food recommendations. I still like the pyramid better. I know, I'm old school. But what if you built your own diet or your own plate based on the kinds of information that educate you and inform you, make you a better citizen, and connect you with the people that you want to be connected to, like people in your community. So that might look like mostly public affairs, reporting, and journalism, but some feature lifestyle too, because I'm a big proponent in that connection piece, what we were talking about earlier, that piece that allows you to get to know your neighbors, that gets you to celebrate people in your community. One of the pieces of news that I usually use when I'm talking to elementary or middle school students is when you're looking through, like, what makes news news? What makes something newsworthy? Is it newsworthy that a local resident won an award for being great for something? It was a woman at our local co-op who won a statewide co-op award, and unfailingly they say, yes, absolutely, that's newsworthy. Because we're celebrating, granted, that's not like this hardcore, it was a soft feature story telling about this woman and how long she'd been doing her work. But that is just as important as the city council coverage, because it provides a different sort of role. There we go. So this is what that might look like in the pyramid form. So this might be people screaming at each other on the TV, or the Kardashians. I haven't heard on the Kardashians, but But, you know, those kinds of things are being consumed in much larger quantities right now than public affairs and community impacts and duties of the fourth estate and giving voice to the voiceless and all those big things. And so if we could all just sort of think about how we're building our information diet, I think we would be better. This is, so I created a nutritional facts sheet so that you can take a look at stories and figure out how good it is for you, how good it is for your community. And that has a lot to do with facts and context and who it impacts and how, and what's the connection piece. Is there any public good? And then you minus things for things like voyeurism or unlabeled opinion or other things. So we're going to practice a little bit. And I'm going to run you through news values first, and then I'm going to show you some news stories, and you're going to evaluate them based on this. So the primary purpose of journalism is to inform, educate, and connect. And that's how usually you can tell if it's good journalism or not, is by looking at its purpose. News judgment comes in as well. So you're looking at what's the impact of it? Is there an impact of this story? Is it immediate? My joke is it's not, they don't call it old, so they call it news. I'm an old editor. I use it more often than I like. How close is it? What's the proximity? You know, a wildfire in Eureka isn't as important as a wildfire next door here, right? Prominence also falls into that category. Novelty also falls into that category, into news values. Something like it's not news if the dog bites the man, but it is news if the man bites the dog. That thing. But that's a trap, and so is conflict, and so is emotion. Those are all news judgment pieces, and it's what journalists look for. But good journalists put more weight on these four than they do on these three. So the whole conflict piece, that can be pretty seductive for a reporter. And I'll give an example. And this is also a novelty. My students and I were covering the legislative session, I think 5 sessions ago. And I'm sure you all remember this story. There was a lawmaker from Missoula, and he had heard from his constituents that there was a naked bike ride in Missoula that was angering people. So he brought a bill that would put some limitations on public nudity, more limitations on public nudity. And in the hearing, after the hearing, he talked to a few reporters, including my 2 reporters, and a reporter asked him a question about what might be banned under this bill. And someone asked a question about yoga pants. And he said jokingly that yes, we should ban yoga pants and Speedos. Joking. And my reporter came back to me, and she had mentioned yoga pants in the story. And I was like, did you say something about yoga pants? Is this really going to ban yoga pants? And we dug into the bill to try to decipher. You know, we talked to, you know, one of the people in the Legislative Services Division who drafted it about the implications of this. Would it really ban people from wearing yoga pants or Speedos in public? And there was nothing there. And I said, where did this come from? And she said, oh, it was, you know, she explained what had happened. I said, okay, well, we're going to take that out. It's not accurate. And we don't know, you know, if we don't know that it's going to ban yoga pants, we need to take it out, because that's going to start a whole thing. So that's what we did. There was another young reporter who was there for the Associated Press. That's what she led with, was that a bill that would ban yoga pants was making its way through the Montana legislature. And being the AP, that immediately went to the A-wire, to the national wire, and spread like wildfire. And I watched as my news feed filled up with story after story, headline after headline about backwater Montana. Again, a narrative that actually doesn't do much for trust in the news media in our neck of the woods. We all know that that's, you know, part of it is is that disconnect between that urban rural divide, that disconnect. And it went like wildfire. The next morning, in the same hearing room, in the same committee, that same lawmaker he was one of the first Republicans to carry the death penalty bill, the bill that would ban the death penalty in Montana. He brought that bill, crickets, absolutely no coverage of it. This guy was roasted and dropped out of the legislature after this whole thing happened. He was a doctor, and nobody covered. We did, and a couple other outlets, but of course, the local and the statewide news covered that bill, but not the national news. And that goes to show you that's how conflict can be a trap. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit too, because that's something that so there's lots of news out there about fake news and how to spot fake news, right? But we can't just, that's an easy thing for us to glom onto without also thinking about junk news, not fake news, which is misinformation and disinformation. But there's also news out there that's real news, but is not quite there. And so this is a handy thing from the museum that helps you evaluate where junk news might be. Look at the evidence, look at the sources. Is there context, which is always important, like in the yoga pants Bill story, right? If the context that he was joking would have been important to include in that story. Who does this impact? And then, of course, there's always the execution. Is it sloppy? That's usually a red flag. But this is the one I always really try to get people to key in on. Does this piece inform? Does it educate? Or is its primary purpose to persuade you? Or is it its primary purpose to rile you up? So I highly recommend, if you're interested in kind of the digital sphere, a book that I have my social media students read actually is called The Chaos Machine by a journalist called Max Fisher. And it talks about the rise of social media and how it's become these behemoths that we now know them to be today. And one of the things that is part of the origin story of the rise of all of those networks has been moral outrage. And it ties into our human need to feel outrage at the other. And the things that spread like wildfire on social media in particular have a lot to do with moral outrage. The study, I can't remember what the numbers show, but the studies are astronomical. If you feel morally outraged by something, you're like 10 times more like, I'm just pulling that out of my hat, but you get me. You're way more likely to share something if you feel moral, and you're way less likely to check it out before you share it, to make sure that it's correct, to make sure that it's factual. So we're gonna assess some news based on that. And I'll hand you these. You can take these home with you, but you want to pass these around. There's a full stack of them. But there's nutritional labels you can fill out at home and your own news diet. But so let's just look at this one based on the nutritional facts. This was recently a recent story I just grabbed from the Shoulder Camp in our county newspaper. We're lucky enough to have 2 papers in Teton County. So if you just kind of read through the headline, number 1, something to always note is if the date is correct or if there's a date on it. Also always good to know if there's an actual byline at the top, if there's an actual person who's accountable for this information. The other thing to look here, there's lots of facts, right? There's who, what, when, where, how. The bus, there's information. Paul Wilson, so the transportation director at Fairfield High School. Wilson said there's an actual primary source. It's not being pulled from somewhere else. So overall, this one would be, now, is it flashy? Is it something that you're going to share that's viral? Maybe not, it's not gonna hit but is it important to the people in Fairfield? Absolutely, it's very community-based, right? There's an actual quote, okay, how about this one? It still has, it's not fake news, right? Still has a headline, or it still has a byline, still has the date. There's some quotes and some facts and some primary sources. But if you look at its purpose and you look at its intent, this one probably might not rate very high on the nutrition label. So it might go up in that unless you're really into Meg Ryan. I don't know. I really loved her haircut back then, so that's one of the reasons that I pulled it up. But something else to notice. You can tell I shop for shoes a lot. I'm a real sucker when it comes to the remarketing and retargeting campaigns around shoes in particular. But you can also tell a lot about who the advertisers are, and that also helps you kind of understand what's this publication and what are they going for. Okay, so this is another one from the Boulder Monitor. You can still see it even when it's not all of it. There we go. So this is one of those stories that I like. We talked about this a little bit last night. Sometimes there's big J journalism, sometimes there's little J journalism, and they're equal in their community impact, or at least pretty equal. So this is about a pumpkin patch. Again, you know, name, date, look at the ad. What does that tell you about this publication? That it's community-based, right? There's quotes, there's information, so this one would rate highly. Okay, before we get to this one, we'll do one from the River Press recently. I'll just read it to you. It's by Bethany, so of course there's a byline at the top. After a successful stand down hosted in Geraldine last year, Fort Benton's American Legion will take a turn hosting veterans on Sunday, November 12th for the district's second annual stand down. There's some good quotes, there's lots of information, and it's that kind of information that we talked about earlier, where information equals civic and community engagement. Also, I'm glad that you picked this one because I wanted to right? How important is that? As far as providing that mirror and that sense of community pride and engagement, that's really key.
May I say one thing?
Yeah.
People are walking in the door now with the pictures. I want this picture.
Yes.
And every year,
Of course.
it grows. It
Yes.
grows.
It's really, that is a community service, and that right there showcases why newspapers should be seen as a community asset, just like the post office and the school and the library and the other things that we have in our communities. Okay, so this one's always fun. So this is from Kickin' 99.1. There's no byline. I cut out the ads because they were crazy. A Fargo, North Dakota man hit his breaking point with Old Man Winter after he decided to use a flamethrower to clear away the snow in his yard. Todd Fox was arrested for reckless endangerment and illegal use of high-powered fire weaponry after taking matters into his own hands, literally. There's all kinds of language of opinion and language of incitement, and it's very inflammatory. And the sourcing is very squishy. Neighbors, no name, noticed a bright orange cloud. When police arrived, you know, Fox did surrender peacefully to the authorities. So there's some little bits of official information in there, but none of it is sourced to it, the actual source. This is totally fake. It was a fake thing that somebody made up and put a bunch of photos of fire on it, and it gained some serious traction. So that, you know, it was on forums and stuff, but then news organizations started picking it up. Most of them have taken it down, but it spread far and wide before news organizations were like, oh, I'm sorry, this wasn't real. But you can see how something like this could be, and again, what's the purpose of this? Is to incite, right? It's kind of, it looks like it's there to inform you, but if you look a little bit deeper into its intentions, you see that it's a little different. And that's where evaluating news gets a little bit tricky, and why we have to be even better than we've ever been before in evaluating these things, and reading between the lines, because, and especially with AI, it's gonna be much different. Okay, so this is your homework. Is you're gonna take that sheet home, and you're gonna evaluate news that you come across, but also I want you all to think about what your news diet looks like and how you can support more of the story ideas that might fall into that bottom part of your pyramid. Something that we talked about last night with Bethany is that my firm belief, that these kinds of community assets can't survive alone, just like the library can't survive alone, and the post office can't survive alone, and the grocery store can't survive alone. It does take a community and community involvement and buy-in for these kinds of news organizations to stay alive. And so the more informed we are about what we're reading and the value of it, hopefully we can also extend that value to these news organizations and make sure that they stay sustainable, by supporting them. So that's the end. So now you have homework. I'm a university professor, so I know I was gonna give you homework. So that's my talk. Things to talk about. Or did we talk it all out last?
I recently went to a film that was hosted by Montana Free Press. Because it started mattering to me over the last several years about where I was getting my news sources, and so I sought them out, and I wonder if other people discredit sources that are not ethical, not newsworthy, not, because I just like, they're not worth my time. I'm not going to pay any attention to it. I know these sources are worth it. I've only got so much time.
Right.
And I kind of wonder sometimes if I'm among the small number of folks.
Unfortunately, you are. The more we get divided into what are called echo chambers, the more we seek out information that validates our own worldview. And that is one of the things that, at the start in kind of the 2000s, this big democratization of media promised that we would have so many more sources of news, and that would make us more informed and better engaged. And what's happened is it's actually bubbled us into these little filter bubbles where sometimes, for the most part, the majority of Americans are probably getting information from sources that they kind of already agree with. And the rise of the opinionated media has done a lot to that, where it looks like journalism, but it's actually opinion.
Right.
And that can be really seductive, depending on where you are in your filter bubble.
Right.
We need more of you, and I'm seeing more of you in the world. So it's not a hopeless thing. And I think many people are waking up to this, for lots of reasons. But including that, so, a stat that I shared yesterday is that the average American spends 8.5 or something hours a day on a screen. And I think we're starting to hit a fatigue level. The other thing that there's becoming more of a push, and as someone who is staunchly First Amendment and doesn't believe that government has any role in a free press, there is a somewhat hopeful movement to look at social media and what it is doing to our political discourse and how it's creating these echo chambers and these filter bubbles that are not only bad for our society, but they can have real ramifications
Right.
in places, I mean, real physical ramifications, physical violence. And some of the reporting and studies that has looked at what's happened when social media is the only news source, so like in developing countries like Myanmar, where the only app that, so it's a long story, but in places like Sri Lanka, where Facebook came in or YouTube came in, and they were the only, because they were providing the media, they were also the only source of information. And that led to some pretty significant violence, even genocide in some places. Now, linking that to that information source is pretty tricky, but there's been more conversation nationally about regulating social media, and you can see it actually with the push to regulate AI now. I think lawmakers are looking back at what they didn't do with social media in the very beginning and learning that lesson that they have to be ahead of it, and that even if this technology is new and creative and promises a bunch of things, that it also has downsides that we as a society and as a government and as a larger community have to look at. But yeah.
So I have a question on the chat. What can we do to help educate kids about being educated information consumers?
It's a really good question. Well, luckily there is a lot of curricula out there that I'm seeing elementary and middle school and high school teachers using as part of even their health curriculum or their social studies curriculum. Unfortunately, across the state, we are seeing fewer and fewer journalism programs. Usually that's where that kind of education happens, is at the staff newspaper or even the annual or the, but we're seeing those dwindle just as teachers are having to teach more all the time and in really resource strapped places. And so, but there has been a push I'm seeing in the schools to teach media literacy as early as elementary school. And there's lots of efforts across the state and across the nation to try to get more of that kinds of information into schools. I've started teaching, I'm piloting an 8-week media literacy and audio storytelling project in my daughter's 7th and 8th grade class. I told her, I'm sorry, but you're gonna have to be a guinea pig for this. That teaches some of this stuff in hopes that we could have, the School of Journalism definitely sees our role as being a helper in Montana in particular in teaching media literacy. And I think most journalism organizations have unfortunately or fortunately taken it upon their shoulders to be the ones to teach media literacy and what's real and what's not and how to evaluate information. But there's great organizations out there. Common Sense Media, for instance, has some really good curricula. PBS NewsHour has some really good curricula. The New York Times has some good curricula. So there's lots of organizations out there that are trying to do doing these kinds of things. One of the things that the journalism school is doing, for instance, across the state is something called the Montana Media Lab, and they're doing a Youth Voices program where they're going to rural and indigenous communities and teaching both media literacy and audio storytelling to high school students. So even those little dribs and drabs, and in particular, assisting teachers in this and not just saying, this is something you need to teach, but instead saying like, here's some options, here's some things that might work. I think getting engaged in that process in your local school, I think is important. And also things like this, I teach Humanities Montana does their Informed Citizen. I'm part of the Informed Citizen catalog of speakers, but Humanities Montana does a lot of work around the state with teens and elementary school kids teaching media literacy. So there's lots of people working on this, and that's really hopeful to me. And I do think that we're starting to get to a point where it's kind of common knowledge that we're at a tipping point when it comes to this stuff, and that it's important to stay engaged on how much we're doing this and what we're getting out of this screen, what's coming at us. And especially for teens who are astronomically using you know, technology more than the older generations, as you saw in that graph.
You know how last night I told you I put the old pictures, the picture that I'm putting in this week really made me think, and then after being down here. It's the annual staff in 1980. There are close to 30 people on the annual staff in 1930 or 1980. You have editors for everything. You know, there were 2 face editors. You have all this stuff, and those kids had to have been learning about that kind of thing. And I don't think I bet I could go get last year's annual out. And the annual staff is probably a handful. And I would think that I was never on an annual staff, but I would think you would learn a good bit of journalism.
You do.
Being on an annual staff, but it's a whole over 20 people. Yeah, an editor-in-chief, a sports editor, you know, everything under the sun, and all those kids were learning things. And I don't think we probably, because it's so much easier to take pictures and do all that stuff immediately now. But I kind of felt that kind of played into it too, because I think the old annuals are better than the new annuals. You know,
Even though technology has.
though the technology has, but those 25 kids that had John O. Jones for his.
And that's what we see, that it just takes one. Like, for instance, my colleague Mary All, who runs the Montana Media Lab, has been working in Browning with their new journalism teacher up there. I don't know if she's an actual journalism teacher or she teaches history or something, but she's teaching journalism to these kids, and they're doing this project. And that's all it takes is one teacher who wants to. That said, it's a tremendous amount of work.
And John O did all of that stuff. These ladies can attest to that. He taught business, typing, that, he was in charge of the annual. He teach shorthand.
And the
That's a skill.
newspaper, the school newspaper.
Yeah, and I thought about that. And I didn't go to that picture for that purpose, but it struck me about that's something that we don't have anymore.
And, part of it, I think, has to do with, as a journalism educator, it can be tricky sometimes because the jobs are limited when they get out of college. It's just not the growth that it was when I graduated in 2002. So the class before me that graduated in the spring of 2001, things were different in the media industry when 9/11 happened, and just like everything else, the bottom fell out and jobs started to dwindle. That's kind of the beginning of the decline for the news industry. So it's been like that for a while, and so making the pitch to a young person that studying journalism is something that's going to turn into a career for them is more challenging than it used to be, or even making the point that in high school these are fundamental skills that you should learn, because again we've gotten to a point where education is about the end goal of the job that you're going to get, and this is the kind of common mentality. But those skills are fundamental to kind of anything, and I'm sort of evangelical about talking about these, like I said, journalism skills. I use more journalism skills in my farming operation, being an entrepreneur, than I did.
You don't use your algebra skills?
I didn't use my algebra skills. And unfortunately, I still can't do a timetable to save my life. But because my other good joke is there are 3 kinds of journalists in the world: those who can do math and those who can't. But they are skills: being able to communicate effectively, being able to think critically, being able to evaluate information and condense it without losing context and value. These are all skills that you use in any job you get later, and in life, really. I always tell my students that the first thing I'm going to teach you is how to hold up your BS antenna. And that's number 1 in life, especially when they're 19 or 20. That's also going to serve you in dating really well. So just so you know, I'm going to hone your BS detector, and that's going to serve you in choosing your partner. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming. Thanks for being here on a beautiful November day.
North.
Sorry, one more question.
Okay.
Do you see social media helping in any way, for instance, socially disadvantaged communities who may not have traditionally been included in local newspapers?
Yes, yes, and yes, and I actually have a whole talk about social media for good. Because that's part of it. I do teach, I'm the social media person, and that's how number one, it's also how I've made my living, quite honestly, is that I can live in Fairfield, Montana, on a farm, and make a living doing things like, I mean, I'm teaching obviously, but you know, when I was freelancing and my kids were little, I did a lot of social media consulting and a lot of social media work. And like I talked about earlier, I'm seeing newspapers using it. You can use, and this is the thing that I try to teach teenagers and middle school students, is that the thing in your pocket is something that you can consume media on, but it's also something that you can be a change maker and create media on. You can use social media to educate and inform. And you see great stuff, even on TikTok. The Washington Post has a fantastic TikTok that is so, they will explain the Fed interest rates on TikTok in a way that makes it actually understandable even for the math dummy that I am. So there, and in serving underserved communities, yes, absolutely. Facebook Marketplace, anyone? I'm a big fan of Facebook Marketplace, Facebook Marketplace. And at the core of it, really the origins of social media were meant to be an opportunity for us to connect in an increasingly divided and isolated world. Where it's gone now is so much different from where it started. I remember one of the first things that I did on Facebook in 2008 was to create a page for Dutton. It was called I'm from Dutton, not Denton. Because we got that.
We live in Shoto County.
Yes,
not
we do.
Shoto, Montana.
Two U's. Yes. Two U's. I was able to connect with, I even like wrote a piece about how lovely it was to be able to connect with people who had this shared interest. We were spread out from all over the place. And it still does fill that role. Absolutely. And there's lots of really good things about it. I get a bit down on it. But it does still serve some of those key purposes that it was founded, that it was created. The original creators had those things in mind, but because of the way that it has sucked attention, and because of the business models, it's really, that's what's kind of driven it. But
running the visitor center, I have several volunteers in here. People come in all the time and say, oh, I found you on the internet. But do you know what? We still go through the most of anything at the visitor center? Maps. I don't care how people got here. If they got here through the internet, they still want a map.
Yeah.
To go wherever.
Yeah.
So I'm supposed to tell you that Casey Bailey asked that question from his train truck. He has zoomed in today.
Say, put back your shirt and your music.
Yes. Well, good. Well, thanks again for being here and for tuning in on Zoom. I so appreciate the opportunity. We love Fort Benton. So thanks.
No, I always try to connect.
But I can imagine.
I always do.
Do your homework. The reason I'm not